Very much for the invitation. It's been very nice to know each other for a couple of years. Because we stayed 1 year in Holland, and we were very happy to help him a little bit on this way. And we're very happy that this gets a continuation. Because the way we look at heritage in Japan and in Holland is very different. So sometimes we look like, what is this? But it helps very much, I think, both sides to re-evaluate what we are doing in our own countries. Hilke spoke a lot about the educational program we run at the Delft University. I want to tell you a little bit about my professional practice in Holland. Maybe this slide is the synthesis of what we consider as heritage and architecture in Holland. First, it's about people. Heritage is very much about what we think is valuable. It's something of us. And for us, heritage is not reliving the past. We do not want to become the people of some centuries ago. It's not like going back to the past. But for us, heritage is that we are people of today, but we look back at what happened in the past, and we take things from the past with us to the future. But the modern life and the historical context together give quality to our life, give identity to the places where we live. Well, I'm a professor, as Hilke explained, in the triangle of heritage and cultural value in the Delft University, which is this very nice faculty, which is an old building and a very contemporary, this is MBRDV design and everything, but all in the context of the historic building. That's only 2 days a week for me, and the rest of the week I have my own office. Meurs, together with Marinke, which is my partner and my wife. And in my office, half of the people are architects and half of the people are historians. So always if we do a project, the historians work together with the architects. What's so funny is that historians, they talk with words and language, and architects, they communicate with drawings and images. So we try to translate the words into images, and the images into words. And by doing that, we try to bridge the gap between the world of heritage, conservation, monument boards, and architects and design. Because together we need each other, we need architecture very much to give significance to our heritage. And we work from 2 beautiful places, one in the countryside and one in the city. And we do all kinds of projects. We're not practicing architects, but we are consultants for conservation, transformation, development, urban planning. And we always try to bring together the interest of the world of the heritage and the world of the design by being very precise on what is the design brief, what is the subject for the architect to make this project. To give you some examples of my work, I want to start with a short introduction of what we think is heritage. And Holland is very different from Japan in the way we look at monuments. This is Holland. It's a small country, 300 kilometers. And it's a country partly below the sea. So Holland is a country where the landscape, the cities, the buildings are like one system. And we feel like nature is something we create. It's a cultural landscape which the regulation of the water over the last 1,000 years was made by man, and that same landscape was already the basis for our cities. The landscape, urbanism and architecture are very together. So all the interventions we do are and where we live is all in this cultural landscape created by man. And today that cultural landscape we see as something very important. So we have many monuments, like 200,000 monuments, conservation areas, and that's very different from Japan. So just to give you some examples of our monuments, for this you can understand the most important churches, but also the historic cities in Holland. They are also monuments. They are urban conservation areas, but all these buildings are also national monuments. Many historic cities are called conservation areas, and then you have the monuments, but you also have our townhouses, are all part of this conservation area. And we have industrial buildings which are listed monuments. And this is even a very famous monument that has become a World Heritage Site last year in Rotterdam, the Van Ellevet. But heritage, as you could see in the first of the projects of the students in Delft, which you just showed, can also be the neighborhoods from the 1950s and 60s. Some of these areas have been listed as monuments. Or the buildings from the 1950s in the downtowns, like the center of Rotterdam, where you have the Lijnbaan, a very famous shopping street, which was made a national monument a few years ago. So all these things can be heritage, and even the landscapes can be heritage. These are two World Heritage Sites. First is a defense system of fortresses from the 19th century around Amsterdam, which is 60 kilometers in length. 60 kilometers of landscape as a monument. What is that? Or this is an example of one of the most beautiful polders we have in Holland. And it's exactly the municipality. So the whole municipality is a World Heritage Site. So everything they change or do, every traffic light is a World Heritage matter. So the question, if we have all this heritage, is how can we live with the heritage and how can we transform and adapt the heritage in a way that we can use it? So use is for us fundamental for preservation. Yeah? Look at Amsterdam. All the red dots are national monuments. So the whole downtown, the railway station, the department store, everything is a national monument. Or look at the map of Holland and you get the idea that we live in one big museum. Everything is heritage, is a monument. At the same time, we want to be a modern nation, a modern country with modern comfort and modern life. So we always have a question, two questions. First is, how can we modernize the places and give them meaning for today's life? And the second question is, how can we bring the heritage value into the design? Yeah? Because this is also our heritage. And many buildings, in particular our churches, because we stopped believing in God, so the churches are empty. But they are very important landmarks in our city. And we have a very big discussion about how can we give a new life to the churches. Not by making everybody Christian again, but by giving a new use. And then the discussion is, what kind of use is respectful for the quality of the heritage? Yeah? And little by little, you can see that we make a very modern technology under the ground. And then all the buildings and monuments stand there as if nothing has changed over the centuries, but at the same time, they have all the modern facilities of life incorporated. Just to give you some examples of what heritage and architecture can do. This is a church in the south of Holland, in the city of Maastricht, which became a bookstore. And it's said to be the most beautiful bookstore in the world. Because you buy the books, you have this beautiful space, and you can say that, but that is a point of discussion, that the word of the book and the word of the Bible is a kind of a very appropriate new use. It's about reflection, it's about deepening yourself. And this is not a party place, but this is a place where the books give a new significance to the church. Or this, it used to be a hospital and it got a new function and you get a modern addition because the architect felt like we should show that something has changed. Or these two warehouses, one in Rotterdam and one in Amsterdam, which used to be dark places where the goods were stocked. But this one is opened up with big windows, a radical transformation, in order to make houses, lofts, with daylight. And this one is even more radical. It was a national monument, but a bridge was needed, so the bridge is going through the monument, and on top of it is a cultural center now. You can understand that there's always a lot of discussion if this is not too much for a monument. But at the same time, we feel like in this cultural center, we give new significance to the monument, and a lot of people go to this place and they experience very much the history of the place. So there's this quality. But how can we find the balance? And that's exactly my work, to think, what is the balance? How can we find out, how can we define the cultural value, not in generic terms, in general terms, but in specific terms. What is the essential value of this church? What are the essential values of these warehouses?
And how can we bring them into the design? That's what my work is about. Yeah? And when we talk about cultural value, we always are confused. We have an argument, and we always say, nobody is against cultural value, but we do not know how to define it, because there are many directions in which you can look for the cultural value. Some people say everything which is old is having a value, old material. So you should not change anything, you should keep the ruin because that is the essential value. Other people say, no, it's not the material value, it's the conceptual value. This is, for instance, the case with a lot of modern architecture, where it's not so much about the historical concrete, but it's about the spatial composition or the sequence of spaces. So you can remake the monument, but the essence is the aesthetics. In Japan, you have this tradition also of rebuilding buildings. For us, this is very new because we come from a world which is so much focused on the material authenticity. I shouldn't tell you, Nara is close by. Sometimes it's that the expert is saying this is a beautiful building of a famous architect, or it was the first time social housing. But for the people who live in this social housing, they don't care. For them, the community value is more important. And sometimes they say that even if the expert thinks their neighborhood is not so interesting, because it's not unique, it's not avant-garde, it's not a famous architect, but it's their home, it's their environment. So a very middle-of-the-road church can be extremely important for a community because it's their landmark which they identify themselves. And some people just look at the object as a kind of a collection of beautiful buildings. And some people look at the landscape, and then the things which are not so important as an object can be very important in the context of a landscape. This is just to show that the interpretation of what makes cultural value has all these different directions. And it's not that you have to choose for each and every building, and sometimes it's only this, sometimes it's only that. We always have to deal with all these values, but sometimes in some buildings this value will be more important than the other values, and sometimes this value will be very important. And that means that depending on how you define the cultural value, also signifies that the way you can transform these buildings changes. So if you all agree what is the essential value, then you also have a basis for intervention and for change. Yeah? So that basically is what we do in our office for many different locations, for cities, buildings, villages, former industrial areas. We try to make research, like Luke said, research is always the starting point, which we want to understand the story. What is the space about? What is making it unique? Why do we make it a monument? And all these things we have to study, and then once we know that, then we can try to find out in space, where do we see it? What makes up the value? Or what disturbs the value? Sometimes you have also negative values. And from there on we want to come to the essential qualities, we call them the key qualities, but also the recommendations, where can you change? So that's what we do, and I want to show 3 projects we did over the last 2 years to give you an idea about this practice. The first is a project which has been running for many years, and that is paid by the railway company. So that's our client. It's a private company, state-owned but a private company. And they have something like 400 railway stations in Holland. And many railway stations are listed national monuments. But the most important historic value is that they are in use as a railway station. So the use is the most important value. And the use of a railway station means that you have to change because the capacity, there are more people coming in the station. You have new safety regulation. Suddenly, for the blind people, something has to change, or for the handicapped, you need elevators. And so all the time, the railway stations are changing if they want to be functioning. But at the same time, you have these beautiful spaces which we want to keep. So the question is, it's very much like the Tokyo railway station. It's very much the dilemma about how can we make all the changes necessary to keep it in function as the station, which is the most important thing we do. But at the same time, how can we incorporate the value, and how can we make tailor-made solutions instead of the same solution for all the railway stations? The railway company commissioned a work and they said, we want to make our own heritage policy because then we can talk with the government. So they said, we make our own policy and share it with the government, and from there on we want to make our own decisions. And the policy is called the collection. So a project was started to identify 50 most important stations in Holland, which all together tell the whole story of the railway company. That's the first job we did a few years ago. So we made an inventory of many different stations, and some are really the icons of the company. But we also wanted to include the less important railway stations. And here you already see one of the dilemmas. This is the same station. So on the platforms you have a beautiful historic environment, but in the tunnel it could have been an airport. And we think that the contrast in heritage is perfect. This is not contrast, this is completely no relation at all. So you go from one thing to the other. And we think that this can be done in a better way with modern architecture, but more in line with the concept. So we were looking for all the railway stations in Holland. We made inventories and we made a lot of studies in order to come to not a listing of important objects, but a series of 50 which represents the whole network. And from there on we could have a policy, a coordinated policy to deal with the transformation. It's very integral with the modern technology. So this is the way we worked. We had a lot of criteria which we wanted to select the collection. We had lots of railway stations, and by giving them all these colors, it's like a systematic thing, we could finally come to a choice of a selection of 50. Some stations you can change one or the other, that doesn't matter, but altogether we felt like the 50 railway stations we choose represent very much all the aspects of the history of the companies which build up the network. Yeah. So then we had these 50 railway stations, and subsequently of all the railway stations in the collection, we made a cultural historic survey. And it's not my office made all of them, we made the manual, and then 10 different offices made all the researches, and we did a few of them. And in this manual, we always study the history of the place. We also try to understand the essential architectonic and urbanistic qualities of the railway station. And from there on, we make recommendations for the railway company. So we do not only make a definition of this is all important, but we also put next to it a kind of a letter to the railway company saying, well, if you deal with this railway station, think about this, don't forget that. So it's a very practical thing included in the reports for all the railway stations. This is a beautiful station in Amsterdam. It's not the central station, but it's a station in a suburb close to the center. It's from 1939. And here we notice that the architecture is very beautiful, but the essential quality is a very early example of a multimodal mode, where buses, trains, trams, taxis, bicycles, pedestrians, and trains meet. And all the flows of the passengers are organized by the buildings. Over the years, the flows have changed. So people don't understand the railway station anymore. And we said, go back to this organization. If you make new flows, you can adapt the station to do it in line with the intention of the architect. And the second aspect of this railway station, that it's very much designed on daylight. On the experience of the traveler when he comes from the city, all the way to the platform, to the train, you have dark spaces, you go to the light, you have a light hole, so there's always this game of the light, and the light is your guide. It's like a lantern which you have to follow and which brings you there. In some areas, daylight has been blocked over here, so our first recommendation was bring that back. But there's also a recommendation that if they are going to make a new entrance on the back side of the railway station, which normally is the case in the railway station, is that you can make any type of modern design, but try to reintroduce the game of the light as a theme for the new design. So the heritage component here is not only about preservation of things, but is saying these are essential qualities of this place, and try to bring them into the new architecture or in the new things that you are creating, in a way that you give a new interpretation of the original concept, and the two of them can meet. So it's like shake hands between the old and the new. Not literally in the architectural style, but in the concept and space, and in this case, the sequence of the flow of the passengers. Yeah. This is a railway station which has a very complicated history because it's an old railway station which was destroyed in the war, and then the ruins were built up as a new facade and then new additions. But today you look at two different railway stations at the same time. The old station, or the ruins of the old station, and the modern facade. And we discovered that in between, the inside of the railway station has been deteriorating more and more and more. So we said the essence of the railway station is the old facade on the side of the tracks, blue one. It's the new facade from the 1950s on the side of the city. It's the square which is still there of the old railway station, two squares which were designed in the 1950s, and it's the tower which is the landmark of this railway station. And in between, that is the design challenge. So the architects which are transforming this railway station were asked to respect very much this facade, to respect the other facades, to reuse the squares and the tower, but also to finally make a connection between the old railway station and the new railway station, between the trains and the city. And this has been worked out in subsequent designs, which, for instance, a lot of additions here are made very transparent in order to keep this idea of the continuous facade going on. So the design solutions are very much based on this idea to respect the two facades, because those are the historic images, but they also have a lot of space to make new interventions in the station. And sometimes talking about the railway stations, it's about big interventions, sometimes it's about small interventions. Without the heritage sensitivity, this elevator would never have been so elegant in this monumental Amsterdam School railway station close to Amsterdam. So the railway company really put a lot of money in making a special solution and not an ordinary solution. And here there was a lot of polemic about an extra entrance to the railway station. And we said, try to keep the original entrance as the entrance for all the tracks, and make the entrance from the railway station and make this a small and delicate building. And this respects the original monument, because there's a little bit of distance between the two. It also makes clear that a modern addition has changed. So sometimes the architecture can be a contrast and still be in line with the heritage logic of the place. And sometimes these things can also be in bricks and more traditional. The second example is in Eindhoven, which is the city of Philips. Philips is the competitor of Sony. And Philips was founded there in the 19th century, and over the years the whole city became Philips. It's really like a Philips city. This is an aerial picture in which you can see all the factories of Philips. But nowadays the production is in China, all the factories are empty. The headquarters of Philips have moved to Amsterdam, which is closer to the airport. So there was a big identity crisis in Eindhoven. Who are we without Philips? And what can we do without Philips? Because in the past Philips was the god of Eindhoven, it was the government of Eindhoven, it was paying for the education of the children, it was building schools, it was building the houses, like a good company is doing. And suddenly they moved out. In Eindhoven, that's very exciting. I think the fact that Philips left was a relief for the city, because they reinvented themselves as a city, very much on design, technology based, but in a very modern sense. So you have the most equipped high-tech campus of Holland is in Eindhoven. It's our competitive university of Eindhoven, but it's a very good university. And they have a lot of design schools in Eindhoven. So it's really a very, you feel it's a very exciting place. There's lots of young people, a lot of things going on. In this area, many monuments had to be recycled. And the most beautiful monuments of Philips are in this area. And a very big project to refurbish all these buildings is underway, and that is really a center for a lot of startups and design companies and design firms, where Eindhoven, the new image of Eindhoven, is taking place. Next to it is this area, and this is the area I want to talk about. It is Strijd Air, an area where the television screens were made in a big glass factory, but the architecture is not interesting at all. compared to the other areas. So Philips sold this area to a developer, a real estate developer. And then the city of Eindhoven said, demolish everything because we need all our money and effort to rescue the big monuments on the other side. So they had this area with the idea to make social housing for the city. But there was a lot of pollution in the ground, so it would be very expensive to redevelop it. And we call it chemical heritage, but normally it's a very negative thing. So then this developer said, well, we have to tear down a lot of things, but we have to add value in order to pay for all this pollution and the difficulty to recycle the area. And they wanted to make added value using cultural historic value as a concept for the new area. So everything had to be demolished, but the first thing the developer did was to call us and say, help us with a concept of how we can put the past into something which adds value to the new thing we want to make. Well, this is very strange for you, for sure. Let's go, let's have a look. So what we did was, again, we made an analysis of the history of the place, and what were the essential features, but we tried to translate that into new quality, into new terms. And we did it together with the people who are branding the place, to think about who are going to live in this area, what are key values for those people. And the historic research added a lot to fine-tune the future uses of the area. This is a complicated story to tell, but the basis for the marketing of the area was the heritage. That is the summary. And there was something else. We said, we're going to demolish everything, but maybe before we demolish everything, let's keep some things and see if they can add value to the new development. Why should we kill the trees which are there? Let's keep the trees because they are instant quality and that's what the new neighborhood needs. But we also said, let's keep a couple of buildings and see if we can find a new use for them. And if we manage to do so, it will make the area more attractive because then you not only have housing, but you maybe have a cafe, or you have a school, or you have a small office, and that makes a more interesting neighborhood. And if you do not manage, you can tear them down in 2 years' time, or 3 years' time, because they are not monuments, so we are free to do that. Yeah? So the urban scheme, the urban plan, was made on the basis of the old structure and the old logic of the trains which organized the whole area. And this, the place where the train was in the past, which was linking the factories, was transformed into a central park. We said, like, this is the central public space. It was the central space in the industrial area, and now we make it the park of the new neighborhood. The green around it became the park around the area, so there could be a lot of green quality in the neighborhood. And here you see the plan, in which some relics, some elements of the past, are incorporated into the design. Trying to find out a neighborhood which has variety in image, but also variety in age, old things, new things, but also variety in use, because the old buildings would allow us to add functions to the neighborhood which otherwise would never come there. And the strategy worked. It worked completely well, because one of the most famous designers in Holland said, I don't want to be at this big area where all the designers are. I want to have my own thing. I want to be visible. So I go to the next door area. And he bought, not only he wanted to keep this part, but he bought a much larger part and started his factory there. It's a factory, it's an outlet, it's a restaurant, it's a place of all kinds of manifestations. It works together with the Museum of Eindhoven, so it's a very active cultural center. Pieter Heineken is the designer who works a lot with recycled wood. For sure, some of you will know the images of his furniture. It's like an IKEA of the design, because he's a very big entrepreneur. So he was the first one to live in this area, to recycle all these factories. And in the meantime, we were tearing down all the buildings, and we were cleaning up all the chemical heritage and cleaning up the area. But we already had an image. So in the branding, we call it placemaking. In the mind of the people of Eindhoven, the area already existed as something very positive and attractive. And there were lots of celebrations and things going on at this place. And that helped very much to attract the people to buy houses in this area. So little by little, in the time that Holland was in a big crisis and the housing production almost stopped, at this place we could sell 100 houses, 50 houses, But little by little this process started, and almost all the new houses of Eindhoven for 5 years were built in this area alone. Yeah. So the image of the new neighborhood is not sand and emptiness, what normally characterizes a new development. This was the image. A vibrant place with a very attractive urban quality, and that persuaded the first people to buy houses in the area. And the houses, they are exactly like the houses normally are in the outskirts, but in the way the material is organized and in the way we have a relation with the public space, we set up a standard in line with the history of Philips and the line of the way Philips was building those houses. And now we have a modern neighborhood where you always feel the presence of history, and even in the architecture you see some parallels, although it's very clearly not looking like factories. These are normal houses, but there is some relation. And this again is the quality of the neighborhood from the start. So this placemaking, that is really the added value of the heritage. These are images of a few weeks ago. This is the heritage which is waiting to be redeveloped and to become the icons of the neighborhood. Peter and Eek has bought this complex. We just chopped off one of the halls and said, well, we want to keep this part, which was a very interesting building, and a little bit of the factory behind. And he's going to make 4 houses for himself, for an architect, a lot of studios. So this is going to be finished probably next year. And with a new architecture, a new back is created. So you will get very exciting projects, which for sure will be published in Japan as soon as it's possible, because the new architecture cannot do without the old, but the old can also not do without the new. And that is, I think, very exciting, that the heritage is not heritage as such, but heritage and new architecture make a quality which is unequaled in the world. I mean, that's making this place unique. So the transformation helps to make it heritage. And this is something which we like to keep, all the installations which were connecting the factories in the past. We like very much to keep this in the public space and make it a kind of vertical garden. But here the regulations about safety and about the public space are very complex. So we are in a big fight with the municipality whether or not we can guarantee for 30 years that nobody will be hurt when this falls down and that everything is stabilized. These are really the things in a new area which help to give this quality of a past, but also specific solutions for the different places. Okay. Do we still have time for a last example, or are you getting very tired? Yeah? Okay, so I first showed you an example which was made by the railway company who wanted to make their own heritage policy because they feel like heritage is very important as a quality for the modern railway network. The second was a developer who felt like heritage and placemaking is fundamental to make an attractive neighborhood. So it's not about the moral duty to keep the monuments, it's about making quality, making spatial quality. The third is the only example which is where the government is our commissioner. And we were asked by the municipality of Deventer, a city in the east of Holland, to work on a strategy for the inner city. It's not as big as Kyoto, it's a very small inner city, but a very historic one with old churches, defense system. This is a picture from the 1930s. It's really an urban conservation area, and at the same time, it is the modern center of a provincial city. Yeah, and over the time, in particular after the war, in the 1950s and 60s, many interventions were taking place in the city, adding modern architecture, modern buildings, modern boulevards to the historic city. And today, all these buildings, they are losing their function. The question is, if this city has a history of centuries and centuries and centuries, do we also keep modern architecture as one of the layers of history? Or do we demolish all the old buildings and make kind of new historic buildings? That is more or less the question there. And to answer that question, they want to have an integral policy, an update for their urban plan for the city. I just want to show you some things, just to show you how we work on it. These are some of the big intervention plans of the past, where all the streets were widened. Well, it's a little bit like what happens in Kyoto as well. And all the modern buildings were added. Like a bridge was added to the city. Yeah. Or this place where a modern bank building was added in the historical timescale. This drawing shows, here is the bank. This drawing shows how the architect really tried to keep the image of the tower, and at the same time make a very contrasting architecture fit into the fabric of the city. Today, everybody in Delft says it's an ugly modern building, we have to get rid of it. We felt like, well, it's very sensitive the way it's put in the city, and it makes the square where it is more special. Yeah? So here you have some of these buildings from the 1950s, school. This is the bank from the previous designs, and all these things are getting empty now. And the question is what to do with them, and can we pay for reconstruction, or is it cheaper to destroy them and make something new? What to do? Now, I'm not going to tell the whole story. I just want to go to the image which doesn't show. But you can see it in your handout. Same because with the illusion of reality. This is the image. It's the map of the city. And I just want to stress that if you talk about urban planning in a heritage city, it's very precise because it's about all the houses and buildings. It's about the structure, it's about the squares, about the green space. So all these things are resumed in this one drawing, which is now very small on your handout, but I think you can get the image. But what you can see is the numbers, 1 to 10. What we did was we tried to find out what are the areas which have a distinct heritage. Like there was one area where all the churches were, the temple district, you would call it perhaps. That's a distinct area. So we said this is one area which is a very special quality. What are the determining spaces which are the most important thing, essential qualities of this area? What are the essential qualities of the defense lines? For each and every of the areas of the inner city, we try to first figure out what are the essential qualities, and from there for each and every area, we said where is the potential or the need to change. And sometimes the potential was that you had to remove the cars and restore some of the public spaces. Sometimes it was that a lot of buildings could be demolished and you could make new things. Sometimes it was that you had a very important monument and that you should hardly even change anything. But altogether they gave a recipe of where can you best try to stimulate new investment and innovations, and where can you keep the character. And I think the difference with many other countries is that we do not look at the monuments and say this is an important house and that is an important house and that. But we look at the areas and we try to understand what are the most important buildings and spaces for the area. And from there on we find the space for the transformation. And now we go to the last slide, which are two pictures from the same city of Delft. That if you think about the whole system and all the areas, that's the large scale. But it goes immediately up to the detail of the facades of the houses and the little things in between. The interior of the houses and the sequence of the spaces. So the detail and the large thing is very interconnected, and that I think, to get back to heritage and architecture, that's the essence of our teaching, is that it's not about only buildings, it's always about a building in the city, and a building with its interior and its construction. So if you talk about the large thing, the small thing is always there. Thank you.